Just a quick note before the episode begins. You'll notice that at the beginning of the interview there is a rather substantial echoing effect from Dr. Yerington's audio. This was due to a connection error with Zoom. I noticed it straight away because I was hearing Dr. Yerington's voice twice in my ear, which made things very difficult to understand. However, I've edited it down as much as possible to make it as easy for you guys to hear as possible. However, I didn't want to interrupt Dr. Yerington as he gave the first account of his experience with his patient Frank. So I let him continue until a reasonable time where I could stop him and we could restart the call. It will fix itself shortly, so please bear with me. I hope you enjoy this episode.
That was one of the stories I wrote to answer a question, I think, on Quora, right?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
It was your experience with the with your patient who was able to identify serial numbers.
Yes, Frank was it was a crazy case. He brought to the OR with almost no information on him, and as he was dead. It was the football had been launched, the zero buzzer had been hit, and we got him to the OR, and we crashed onto bypass, and we were on bypass for a while, I think just on 2 hours, and then we had a pretty rocky transition. I think we worked on about an hour, stabilized heart beating, him to the ICU. That was also prolonged for a little bit, and then honestly, I'm home that day, and I thought, you know what, it's okay, because I've done bad hearts before, people die and all that sort of stuff, and I just thought I'd mounds in the ICU the next morning, but the and I hear the story if I said it that was the next morning, but in reality it was actually the morning after that, because Frank's case was at the end of a 33-hour shift for me, and when I went home, I didn't have to work that next day. So the next day for me was the next day that I went in, which is almost 30 hours later. And I went in, I got into the hospital about 5:30. I'd round in the ICU, then go get my ORs ready. And there was Frank eating breakfast, and let me tell you, that was it was a double take, because there was there's no way this human being should be eating breakfast. He should have tubes all in him and the rest of the stuff. And as soon as I opened my mouth, he knew who I was, which was also so shocking, because I had an ID badge on me, but I'm standing, further than we are really apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, how does he recognize? He's like, I recognize this. And so that was the start of the freak out, right? And nurse kind of rolled her eyes at me, and then when we talked outside, she's like, he remembers OR, he doesn't shut up about it. And I had recall before operations, where for whatever reason, normally it was massive blood loss. So if a patient under anesthesia has a ton of blood loss, then the anesthetic levels in their blood will fall sharply, and that can bring them back up to consciousness. And then as you get anesthesia levels back up, they go back to unconsciousness. And generally, the patients don't fight, move, or do anything because they're chemically paralyzed. So they don't ever respond. The only thing you see is the physiologic markers for the body's metabolism sharply rise. So the production of carbon dioxide, the heart rate, blood pressure, or anything that you're measuring sharply rise to give you an indication that physiologically the body is experiencing trauma or pain or at least sensing something. Even if it's just at a spinal level, if the body's sensing something, and that lets you know to turn anesthetic level. But in massive traumas, and I did a lot of trauma in 2003, 4, and 5 at El State University, you can sometimes see entire shifts in blood volume in 20 minutes. So imagine replacing an entire patient's blood volume in 20 minutes. You also replace all the anesthetics. They're all on the floor. Super blood.
Yeah.
So that's seen many times. And sometimes the patient will say that if they remember hearing protein or pressure or things of that matter, or remember weight or face is another one I had, because I didn't just investigate my case as part of a team OSU that we did sentinel events. So whenever anything went wrong, no matter how small, it created a sentinel event, and then we would do an error analysis to find out what went wrong, right? So, Frank was kind of, it kind of caught me off guard that first day, that first morning, right? But then the operating rooms, I heard from some of the in the circuit nurses that there was a guy who remembered everything from his cardiac surgery, and I'm like, that can't be him. So I talked to some of the nurses, and they're like, oh yeah, he remembers the conversation, remembers some of the things said. And then one of the nurses told me the weirdest thing is that he remembers floating above us, right above the OR lights, just staring back at him. And that's not possible. My brother was a senior resident at the time, and he's actually a anesthesiologist in Indiana. And I talked about this with him at the time, and he's like, he says, have you ever been waking up from a dream where someone's talking to you, and you incorporate what they're talking about into the dream?
Mm.
And I said, sure, I understand that state of consciousness and all that sort of stuff. And he kind of blew it off at the time with me, and I said, there's something eerie about the way he talks. It's so matter-of-factly. And Frank was not the bright bulb in the. You got the idea, he did the jobs, but nothing was complicated, and that's kind of the thing he was. And so anyway, the same day I went back because I gotten a little, I've gotten a few tidbits about the lights, and so I went back at the very evening, and I asked him what he was doing and everything. We talked very briefly because it was like 7 or 8 o'clock at night, I think, that first day. And he said, I really want to thank you because you never gave up on. He goes, I know the other people were giving up, but you never gave up. And I have a saying that I've said, if you're good enough at anesthesia, you can go take a piece of steak from your local chop house, resuscitate it, put a tube in it, put it in the ICU, and claim it's alive 24 hours. He remembers me saying that line. And I had said it, I go, he deserves it. I said to the surgeon, I go, I get it, it's a disaster, but let's at least get him back to the ICU and let him die there. That way we can say goodbye. We have done our job as medical people. He remembered the steakhouse comment, and actually he remembered I said 54-ounce porterhouse. And I was just like, you really do remember that? And he's like, oh yeah. He goes, I remember it was like listen to a radio that just I can't change the channel. That was another description. It really kind of freaked me out. So my wife also did hearts. So my wife and I both anesthesiologists, and we kind of all went through Ohio State at almost the same time. She was a couple of years ahead, my brother a couple of years behind, and so I talked with her and my up colleagues and my mentors about recall. I had done phone calls with people about recall. He was just so matter of fact, and he wasn't mad about it at all. I'm like, dude, your chest wide open, you in searing pain. He's like, I felt nothing. He's like, I don't remember any of that. There was no pain. I'm like, okay. But yeah, so then second day I went in the main, and he was getting his one-line discharge, and he was actually moved from the bed to sitting place. And that's when he told me, he goes, they don't believe me. They don't believe I was awake. And I said, well, I go, you got to remember, far side, it's not very comfortable for us to realize that sometimes people remember in the operating room. I go, there's a lot of people that they got to live the next 25 years of their career, including me, with the idea I'm doing a really good job and people aren't awake during surgery. And I understand that, and that's he actually said, he goes, you check the serial numbers on the top of those lights. And then he read them out, and it was 7-8 digits each. And I was like, okay, because that's actually when I went, all right, this guy's off his rocker, right? And so I went out, and the nurse, funny, is like, she goes, did he say the serial numbers first? Oh, yep. And he said, she goes, I wrote them down. And so I looked at, hers, and they were really the same. So I actually went back in. I said, Frank, read those serial numbers again. And they were exactly what she'd written on paper. I was tired. I was over actually in the James Hospital, which is not where the hearts are done at all day. And so I entered 12 to 15 hours of triple room coverage. And at the end of the day, on my way to the garage, I have to cross through where that hospital part is. And I thought, maybe I'll just go.
And have a look.
And then I lost my nerve. I said, I actually don't want to know. Third day, I wake up. Frank's leaving the ICU that day. Didn't really talk to him. I just said hi. I signed off on the chart because he was leaving ICU. I had done my full anesthetic care, checked all the boxes so the people are happy, right? And that day I couldn't get it out of my mind. I couldn't get out of my mind. I couldn't get out of my mind. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I just went in there, pulled the damn lights out, still stood up on the thing. And I went and looked at the serial number on manufacturer's, and it was like 15, 20 digits long. And I was like, okay, no problem. Then I looked, and up closer to the center of the lights, the OSU serial number sticker. And that's what he had remembered each one. And I just went, that was it.
It matched perfectly.
It matched perfect. So clearly Frank had an out-of-body experience. And clearly he stuck staring at those numbers. I mean, there is no other way. The guy worked at OSU. I believe he was like an hour and a half south of Central America. Central Ohio is where he was from. He had come up through a D, which is a hospital that's 55 minutes south of us. And he came into the ER, wrapped up, basically up to the OR's dead. And sometimes we get cardiac patients like that. And if you get them and they still have a blood pressure, which he with compressions, we do everything, right? Sometimes we do, especially in America, but that's what happened. And this was like 2000. I want to say 2004 when this happened. 2003, 2004. It was right in there. Might have been early 2005, but I have this recollection it was late 2004 or late 2003, early 2004. But I think it was in the winter because I remember I think it was cold outside during when this. But that's really, I'm not. I can tell you after that experience, I did really about neuroscience, consciousness, how the brain works, how our anesthetics work. About a year after that, the BIS monitor was invented, and the BIS monitor goes on the forehead here, and it is a really poor man's EEG. So it's measuring the electrical activity in the brain, and what we use it for is a simple sinusoidal curve, which is conscious, dead, and right about 60 is asleep. So we get them right below 60, and that way we can maintain anesthesia so that they're not awake, have no memories, and we have a record of it on EEG. Mm-hmm. And from my understanding, one who has had a BIS properly used with a level below 60 has ever had any recall in the operating room. Now, I've done traumas with the BIS on, and massive blood loss. I've seen it flip up to 90 and flip down to 50. So I now have seen visual confirmation of what we used to get by just our stories is in the OR. You can actually see it happening with the BIS monitor which is really cool. We did not have a BIS that wasn't sort of the OR normalcy at that time. Now that's a marker that's used much more frequently. So yeah, I mean, actually, when I started anesthesia, we did use end-tidal CO2. We just used oxygen, and now it's routine use for both carbon dioxide, oxygen. So, do you have any questions?
Yes, but I wanted to say just before, I didn't want to interrupt you, but we're having a couple of audio issues.
Okay.
Brilliant.
So you can hear me much better now.
I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, your audio was kind of repeating itself half a second after you said something, so it was very
Did you get most of
that.
Yeah, did you get most of the story though?
Yeah, I could understand it perfectly. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's fine.
First off, were there any parts that were unclear? And it's really funny. I knew this phone call was coming up. I talked to my wife this weekend in bed. We were watching Ozarks, and she saw this on my calendar, and she's like, do you remember much more than this story? And I was like, no. And I kind of had just talked about this with her on our couch downstairs. And she's like, does it still freak you out? And I said, no. I said, the older I've gotten, actually, the less it freaks me out. And I said, it's almost like the more okay it is that there's that there's something else beyond the five senses and the consciousness while we're awake. And I go, that actually, in some ways it's kind of comforting over time, I think,
So does that experience then kind of point you towards the direction which is kind of the position I am more inclined to believe, that consciousness maybe is separate from the brain in some way?
So in the last decade and a half, I have read quite a lot on neuroscience and consciousness itself. And, there's been quite a lot of research in anesthesia, like how does anesthesia actually work? And, I come from a physics background, even though I was an English major and I ended up writing and stuff, but my first love was physics and I wanted to be a physics professor. And so I see the world often in mathematics and physics, and I understand I understand relativity pretty good, and quantum mechanics actually better. And I got to the point of understanding that the human brain doesn't operate in a binary system because it would not allow for consciousness like we have it. And so you need more, and I try to explain it simply, you need more bandwidth in decision logic than a primary 0 and 1. You need a yes, a no, a maybe, and none of it. And if you have all four of those states, which you do in quantum entanglement, then consciousness itself could simply be all of the neurons all in the yes, no, maybe, nothing state, where in that next moment, it could be this, but it could be this. And it's in that intertwining moment that consciousness lives, where for simple quantum mechanics, the particle is in the bucket and the particle's outside the bucket at the exact same time. But when you look at it, it's only one place. So if consciousness is the capability of it being in both places at exactly the same time until you look at it, then consciousness is always that step right behind time unfolding. And I kind of think of it in that way. And if that's what consciousness is, then the sensory apparatus that we have might not be the five senses that we call senses. Those might not be the only senses we have. Those might be the easily measurable senses. I can measure light. I can measure sound. I can even measure olfactory chemicals. I can measure time or touch, pressure, temperature on the skin, right? Taste is a hard one because you might think an orange tastes one way and I think it tastes another way, but each one of us, given enough oranges, will both agree that this tastes like, to us, an orange, right? And so, I think that there's more senses like taste out there where you experience the world in one way And, I think everybody at some point has gotten an eerie feeling that whatever is about to come next, they should pause. And it doesn't matter, whether it's a complete freak out. Like I was at an intersection with my girlfriend when so this is in medical school, the fourth year of medical school, and the light turned green and I went to go and she screamed stop. And nothing happened for like a second and a half. And then this car went right through the intersection. And I went, holy shit. And I'm like, did you see that coming? Because I didn't see it coming. I don't think he even had headlights on. And so as we went, she's like, no, I just knew it was coming. So I'm thinking maybe she heard it and I didn't hear it, But it was so distant and so far off that I'm just like, there's no way, right? But then you think about it and you're like, okay.
Yeah.
In that moment, her consciousness was aware of something that maybe she didn't know she was hearing. But part of her brain was putting things together going, there's an engine approaching you at high speed. But it really freaked me out. And had she not been with me, I'd have gotten in a car wreck. So, but I think everybody has those moments in time where they just know. In sports, if somebody can do that consistently, we call them in the zone or a great player or a playmaker, right? And all they are is just experiencing time in a certain manner that is just a little bit better than everybody around them. And so what if it's not just time? What if it's also space? What if it's matter and energy? What if it's, life and death? What if there are senses in those places that we can't physically measure easily? But I think there's an awareness out there that, there's more. And when you talk to like Buddhist monks, because I was into martial arts in my 20s, and you talk to monks and martial artists and stuff, and they're like, sure, when you turn all of this off and you turn inward, there's still something there. And, that the greatest explanation I've ever had was a Buddhist monk that, when you really reach the highest level of meditation you can, there is no time, there is no space, there is no gravity, there's no forward, there's no backwards, but you are still in a place that is filled with radiance and existence and color, and it is, and it's all coming from within, and all you have to do is turn inward. And he explained it. Imagine being in a huge room that it has a yellow warm glow to it, and you're floating in the center. You have no body, but you are in the center everywhere you look at the same time. And the one place you're trying to look is inside, and you can't look there. But that's the one place. And if you're sitting there, it doesn't matter in the real world whether it's 2 minutes or 2 hours, no time matters or anything, because you've discarded all the senses except for consciousness. And consciousness, you can't be conscious and see your own consciousness at the same time. And
it's like
so
in that,
right, in that way, it very much feels like if you peeled back all the layers of this reality and this existence and the way that we sense it, you would get to a moment where you can either know the particles inside or outside the bucket, but you don't know ahead of time where it's both, As soon as you go to observe it, you either know where it's going or you know where it was, but you can't know both.
No,
and
right.
So I kind of think of consciousness in that way. And of course, anesthesia, I believe, disrupts that quantum state between neurons. This neuron's either going to connect to this one or this one. And there's one moment where it's connected to both, or neither, or maybe this one or this one, or it's doing absolutely nothing. But until it makes the connection, you don't know what it's going to be. Where I believe that anesthesia itself eliminates that probability from occurring. And the more neurons probabilities that go to neither, making no decision at all, making no connection at all, that's consciousness shutting down. I don't believe the consciousness zero state is I'm connecting or I'm not connecting, or it's a maybe. I think consciousness, when it's removed, is the neurons aren't doing whatever would be like even when you have a binary conception of something happening, it's either this or that. It's either left or right. It's up or down. I believe there's a third option. Well, there's fourth option too, but it's either one, and then there's neither. So imagine if I'm supposed to tell you where to go, and I tell you can't go right or left. Mm-hmm. I know, but you have to go, but you're not going right or left.
Yeah.
And those are your only two choices. You're like, that doesn't make any sense. Because as soon as you pick right or left, you can't go the other way. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I've come to grips with consciousness over time from everything that I've kind of learned and, read. And then, you read other doctors they've written books about near-death experiences, and they've written books about their own experiences in understanding physiology and then living life. And they try to combine that into a script that other people can learn from. So,
mm-hmm. Okay.
Sorry, keep going.
It's all right. So let's get back and actually look at, was it Frank?
Yes.
Let's have a look at Frank's experience from, because I always prefer to look for kind of the material explanations of everything first, because that's kind of the ground that we understand before we start to jump into the, if you want to call it, paranormal explanation.
Sure.
So one of the, when you posted on Quora, it was shared into a few Facebook groups that I'm part of, and I could see that there was a few comments from the from those that proclaim themselves skeptical that came up with a few explanations, and I just wanted to get your opinion on them. So the first one that I saw was regarding the serial numbers on the lamps, which is to me the most profound part of the experience.
Right.
Was the serial number was presumably on the top of the lamp?
Right. So the lamp has a big half moon shape, and then it has a bar that comes out with pins here so that it can rotate in all directions. And about 2/3 of the way to the center, there was this sticker. It was a white sticker with a red silver thing around it, and it had a number in it. It was an engineering number for materials at Ohio State Medical Center. I hate to do this to you, but I've got my wife calling in, and I've got another phone call to get to right now because it took late to do this. How late is it there?
It's 7 o'clock here, but time's not really an issue.
Time's not really an issue. Can you call me back? Let me calculate this. Can you call me back in 2 hours?
Yep.
Okay, because that will kill the rest of my business today. I'll get it all done.
Yep.
Because I want to continue, because I actually have several explanations, and they're not all mine. There are other anesthesiologists that have told me this is probably what happened. This is probably what happened. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is most of them are just explaining away stuff that's happened in their own careers that they can't figure out. So yeah, I want to continue because this is the first time I didn't really get a chance to talk to Titus about stuff. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I got to take this phone call. I will talk to you in 2 hours.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Where were we?
Yeah, so we were talking about Frank's experience. We were saying that the one explanation, that I heard was that maybe Frank could see the serial number from his position when he was lying down at the lamp.
Correct. And there is a time in the OR when that happens. And when he came in, we were doing CPR on him. So we took over basically the transfer, came out of the trauma department, and we took him across the 4th floor at OSU there over to OR 20. And I don't think I was doing CPR, although I was doing CPR in the room while we were doing multiple things that, obviously there were more than one of us there. But I remember when they were ripping stuff open and they were going as fast as they can, one of the things they do is they flip the lights they invert them upside down, and they screw on the sterile handles and then flip them back. So, well, actually, they screw on the aluminum thing, then they flip them back, then they press the sterile covers over them. So there is a possibility that he had no anesthesia on board. He was on the transport right before we put him over to the bed, and the lights were inverted for 30 seconds. And his eyes might have been open because it might have been before I taped them shut. You know, I believe his eyes were shut and taped when he came in the room, but I honestly can't remember that detail. But that has crossed my mind, is that it might have been the last image he had in his head before we over and started going, before the blue drapes covered him and the tape was on his eyes, you know, for sure at that point. You know, that was certainly a possibility. At the end of the case, his eyes were taped all the way to the ICU. So he, you know, that was not a possibility. But that has dawned on me that there was so much stuff going on that, because, you know, somebody was doing there were so many things happening in that probably 8 to 13 minutes that it took from him to hit the door to be on the OR for them to crack the chest. That it is possible that they removed whatever was on the ER. I can kind of see it in my head where they might have, sometimes we take whatever the ER is done for transport off of his face, and then we repackage to protect the eyes and ears, lips and mouth and nose correctly. And in that exchange, there might have been a time where his eyes are open, but he would have been chemically probably paralyzed at that point. So he could have had what we, you know, locked in syndrome, where you're wide awake, you're just completely paralyzed. But because his heart's not working, we're doing CPR on him to get blood pumping. So there is a possibility he would have stared at those. He doesn't remember.
Yeah, in that possibility.
He doesn't
in that possibility, I was going to say,
yeah.
would his consciousness have been completely as if awake in that stage?
It actually could be, because if we had restored good blood flow to his brain and he was paralyzed, he might have been wide awake. Even though he couldn't pump his own heart and he couldn't establish his own blood pressure, he might have been wide awake in those moments. You know, I do very good CPR. I've done CPR with A-lines in it. I'm a big guy. I'm powerful. I know how to compress the chest exactly. I even know how to time the systole and the diastole, only because I've literally performed CPR like 500 times. So it's, and I don't know how well it was done with the guy riding the cart on the way to the OR versus me in the OR when I had more control of the situation. But it has dawned on me, and you know, I wasn't the one who brought this up. It was an older mentor, a colleague of mine, that said, well, did you ever take the tape off his eyes when you transferred him over from the ER to the OR? Because if they're paralyzed and you take the tape off their eyes are open. You have to physically close them again and retape them after you know, I would have squirted lube in his eyes to further protect them, and you can't see shit through the lube. So, but that there would have been a moment where he could have been staring, and if the nurses in the room were working with the lights and they had inverted them, you know, the writing on the label was big enough that he probably could have seen it, because it would have been 4 or 5 feet from his face. And it's not like he could turn his head or anything. So it's always been that possibility. But, you know, he described it as floating above because he was staring down with us.
Yeah.
And the eerie thing about Frank was he remembered our conversations like maybe somebody who's a friend of yours that really likes movies, how they quote lines. It was very eerie. That he had some of the banter in the OR, you know.
That's the thing I'd question, is if he was in a state where he was, as you say, locked in his body but still conscious. I don't see how he'd then report seeing the number from above. He'd report seeing it as he was.
Correct.
Unless he was kind of in a semi-conscious state or a subconscious state where his eyes were still picking it up and his brain filled in the rest.
Yeah, but I mean that's and with the lights inverted, if they're on, there's a tremendous amount of light going up. So even if he had an out of body experience when he was staring down and the lights were down, it would just look like a tremendous amount of light. I don't know. I mean, I've tried to pickle this over in my head before. The serial numbers were the thing that really, set this experience completely aside from all the other recalls I've dealt with, because the majority of the recall is, I heard you guys talking about my breast in the OR. Or you were talking about your golf game and you weren't interested on my when surgery's gone wrong and a patient's had recall, they say a lot of things. But most of the recall is actually fairly stupid from the ORs. Pain is not generally something, unless you have an anesthesiologist abusing narcotics and they're stealing the narcotics and they're leaving their patients in pain. Generally, recall doesn't go with pain. It's normally auditory, or sometimes they'll remember their body being moved, or they'll remember not being able to move. Like, I at least had a dozen where they're like, I kept trying to shake my hand so you guys knew I was awake. Mm. And we're like, you're paralyzed. So yeah, you in your brain, you thought you were shaking your, or I tried to talk to you, but I couldn't make any noise. That's another one that you hear.
So are these recollections always from the point of view of being in the body, though?
Being in the body and on the table. And the table was cold. That is all. I mean, when I ask people, describe what it felt like, I get the weirdest answers because I ask very open-ended questions because I want to hear it. But I've heard the table is cold from like a ton of people. And that makes total sense because it's a metal table with a piece of rubber on it. I mean, it's a cold table, which is really odd that they have this sensation of it being cold and yet they feel no pain and we're in the middle of surgery. But I've also had people where, I felt a tremendous amount of pressure in my abdomen and we were working on maybe a gallbladder, or I couldn't breathe, I couldn't take a breath, but I knew I was there. But they describe being in the body and they describe hearing our sounds, or they'll describe the surgeon pushing against the side of their body, because he's leaning up against them, but they can't move and they're taped to the table. They don't know they can't fall. But I've heard those things throughout the years that I've done investigations and stuff within the teams where we look at an OR record, look at the surgeon's record, talk to the nurses, talk to the patient. And a lot of the time, once you can explain to them what happened, people don't sue unless there was a bad outcome. But it's been interesting being in on those conversations when, I had my own, and in fact, probably one of the reasons I was even on those teams that I kept interest in it, was because of the Frank incident. I mean, it was one of those things I wanted to hear one other anesthesiologist have the same complete craziness type thing where there was an out of body experience and
I wonder how many people in the professional fields in medicine and anesthesiology and whatever, I wonder how many of them actually have had several of these experiences but are too kind of apprehensive to come out about them for professional danger to their careers.
So it's not just professional protectionism of a career. If you know that the thing you're doing is not 100% perfectly certain to work, and you're doing major trauma to people and causing a lot of pain, or you could cause a lot of pain, I think you drive yourself crazy thinking that maybe every step I take is not going to produce the results I think it is, and then I might be responsible for doing somebody harm. I think you have to use human denial to separate that and say, no, this is the standard of care. This is what I apply. It's supposed to work 99.9999% of the time. Yeah, I may realize statistically there's that 0.0001, but it's not going to happen to me because I'm going to roll the dice 30,000 cases in my career. I'm not going to be one of those people, right? And so I think there's a little bit of professional denialism in order to protect yourself. And then the other thing is, medicine itself does not attract devoutly faithful people. It attracts questioning, scientific, deliberative, evidence-based type human beings. When you are faced with a 4-year program where everything that happens in a human body is explainable if you have the right data, and then you go out and you apply that in residency and in your early attending years, and then something happens that is unexplainable for everything that you just learned, I think that most doctors are not wise enough at those points in their career, because they're not old enough to have lived enough life to say, yeah, maybe there's a 1 in a million chance it's not just all evidence-based, guys. There's a chance we've missed something in the equation. And I think, the longer you live as a human being, I think the more of those possibilities and those speculative what ifs, reality is this way or that way. One of my kids here found out that Stephen Hawking, because he's doing physics next year, but he was reading how Stephen Hawking in his last year of life was absolutely convinced every human doesn't exist and we're just playing a video game. And we're not even the controller. There's somebody else controlling us that's playing the video game, right? And I told my son, I said, doesn't that make sense from Stephen Hawking's point of view, though? He was confined to being still in a wheelchair, and he was watching a video screen of life go in front of him. So from his point of view, it's quite possible that in questioning his own mortality, which was always coming to an end, that was just how he defined his own understanding of reality, so he would be okay with it when the lights went out, it was an interesting, I said, but no, we're not all trapped in the matrix, even if the smartest guy on earth thinks we are. Like, that's not how it works. And so, it's interesting, but I think that doctors, while they're in their careers, certainly have this huge protective denial wrapped around themselves, because otherwise, how would you go back the next day and slice the next person open?
Yeah, because you couldn't without that certainty that it's guaranteed to have an outcome. Yeah.
And then, of course, the entire profession, you can't ever talk about your psychological problems. You just get kicked off staff.
Yeah.
Your contract is not renewed on July 1st. It's a real simple process, and they don't have to tell you why. You have a 1-year continuous contract, and on July 1, they tell you whether or not you're continuing, and there's no reason. And they do that. Hospitals do that to protect themselves. Medical groups do that to protect themselves. You have a guy going through an especially bad divorce, or you've got a woman dealing with failing physical problems or whatever, and they're going to up at some point. They just haven't up yet, and you're like, look, it's maybe not next year, but they need to be in a different situation, right? They don't need to be in our private group when that happens. And so, those discussions among docs suck, because you're basically firing one of your own. And, it's not like you can say, well, are you in therapy? Are you doing this? No, none of that matters. When you're in an exacting profession, mental illness is completely not tolerated. And so anesthesia is one of the most exacting sciences you can be in the medical field. There's no tolerance for screwing up. If you screw up in anesthesia, you're gone in 3 to 5 years, because you'll kill 2 or 3 people. They'll look at your records and you're toast. It's really easy, actually. It's like an airline pilot, where an airline pilot, well, no, mostly when the airline pilot screws up, they kill themselves too. But it's that level of exacting. Like, Delta does not tolerate a pilot deciding he wants to land the 747 at 180 miles an hour instead of the recommended 162 to 164 miles an hour. he lands that plane at 162 to 164 every single time, or he doesn't fly it. So, but when you take perfection and expectations at that level, I think the psychology itself becomes difficult for that mindset, more difficult than those that are drawn to art and innovation and creativity and entrepreneurship, where a lot of their mind is always looking for the possibility or the probability of the next thing, as opposed to doing the best, most perfect thing right at this moment in the present, So there's that. I think about that.
So perhaps that's why most of these medicine-based doctors and folks in that industry are very, very much closed off to the possibility of paranormal and other non-natural phenomena that we see. I mean, there's a
non-easily explained.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, there's some such as I don't know if you know Dr. Jeffrey Long, who's an oncologist who did research into near-death experiences and had a huge online collection of them. There's Pim Van Lommel as well. All very, very respected doctors in their field.
I briefly looked into the whole near-death experience stuff around that time, through the end of my career, because 2009, of course, my left arm stopped working and I lost my career. So, I had this 5-year period where I was really into looking at stuff like that, and my mind was very open. And then everything became very selfish about, is my family going to be okay? Are we going to keep the house? It was the basic stuff, right? And then eventually, when I realized it was a permanent loss and I was never going back, I fell into depression, which lasted through 2016. And since 2016, I've been recovering from that moment. And so, and part of that recovering is just telling my story and being okay with telling my story in whatever little facets I've included on Quora or Medium or wherever I've written. And, I'm in a very unfortunate position with my disability insurance that I can't earn money. So it's hard to know everything I know and then not be able to use it to generate income. That's kind of like, it's cruel, 29 and a half years in school and no further income.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, no one can stop me from writing. No one can stop me from sharing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm outside my career, so that never matters. So that, I never would have written about Frank while I was practicing.
No.
Never would have happened.
No.
Right. And so I probably would have gone 30, 35 years, and Frank would have been such a distant memory. I'd be like, yeah, weird stuff happened. And, it was a parlor trick. Somehow he remembered the lights, But I do remember my heart skipping a beat when I was standing on that stool. I do remember that totally clearly. And because the scrub nurse in the room was African American, and she was in there. It was between cases. It wasn't sterile, so we were just standing in there. And of course, there I am in the middle of the room, standing on a stool, looking at top of the lights. And she said, yeah. She says, that was a messed up case. And I'm like, in what way? And she goes, well, I heard he was dead the whole time. I was like, yes, I know, that's why it was messed up. So, yeah. There's no reason that man should have been alive at all. It was, he just didn't have blood flow for so very long. I mean, I think what saved him, honestly, and this is just basic physiology, he was cold. So he came in cold. I remember when we went on bypass, he was cold. His body temperature was low, and it was like 32 degrees centigrade. So it was, I do remember that. And then I kept thinking that maybe the cold had something to do with it, that everything was just slowed down. And that's why his brain, that's why his brain was okay. But out-of-body experiences, if you read about them, lots of people have had them. Lots of people talk about them. And I'm not talking about near-death experiences. I'm just talking about out-of-body experience. whether you want to talk it's in terms of like I know people sometimes can visualize far distances away or something like that.
Remote viewing.
Remote viewing, that's what it's called. So I would consider that kind of like an out-of-body experience type, right? You know, and there's certainly other ones where, especially like among twins or mothers and children, where the children are injured or the twin is injured and the other one knows it, but it's not a visual out-of-body experience. It could be an auditory, or it can be a touch physical thing. So yeah, I certainly have run across enough of that I've concluded that the entire human race can't be lying. That would make no sense.
No, or deluded in any way, or misremembering, or which is the common kind of explanations.
I think a large percentage of the human race could be deluded, but not all of it. You know, it can't be all. It can't be everyone every time is deluded.
And if it is a delusion, it's a very consistent one.
Yes, which would make it not a delusion, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that by very definition, if you know we're all seeing the same exact delusion, then it's reality. So the fact that we can't explain it might be frustrating, but you know, I don't think that's a reason to discount. You know, I know I certainly was freaked out for a while from it. You know, I even it was funny. I even started pushing more. Like, there's a drug we give, midazolam. Versed is kind of like our amnesia drug that we give, you know, in the pre-op area when we're on the way back. And I do remember for about a year, I used far more of that than I had in the past. Just because I was like, I am damn sure no one's remembering shit, you know, in the future. But, you know, it's funny because at OSU, at least, they go over your pharmacy records every year with you. And I could see that I had this huge uptick in Versed use. And I basically said I had a patient with recall, and they're like, a lot of anesthesiologists do that, you know, but, you know, what you want to do is correlate that with your, you know, PACU times and everything. And this was before electronic records, before they really got to the science of how to make the most amount of money in the least amount of time with operations. And that science is developing. But yeah, I can remember doing that. And then I backed off for a while, and I only did it when it made sense. And, you know, eventually you get older in your career and you get smarter. You know, so, but then my career got cut short, and that sucked. But, you know, I would have never written those stuff if it didn't get cut short. So we wouldn't be talking here if that hadn't happened.
Everything happens for a reason, so they say. It's just damn hard while it's happening.
Or we're deluded into thinking that's the way it is, right?
Yeah. There was a question I wanted to ask you that I promised a guy that I'd ask. I think you've already covered it, but it's going back to Frank's experience. He wanted me to ask, I've written it down here. He says, how can you be sure you've investigated the veridical perception? He's a near-death experience researcher. How can you be sure you've investigated the veridical perception correctly, and what would you say to those who say you're lying? Presumably about seeing the numbers on the light.
Oh, because I wasn't the only one that experienced that. That was ICU nurses. That was the scrub nurse. The surgeon was actually incredibly dismissive about it. His name, I believe it was Dr. But of course it might, but I think it was, the surgeon, I remember being very dismissive about the whole thing. And he just said, these things happen. That was it. The whole explanation. On to the next case.
Yeah.
These things happen. You know, as far as lying, I don't know that one would make up that story for any.
No. I mean, if you were to be lying, it'd be for some sort of benefit to you, wouldn't it? But as far as I'm aware, you haven't made any money or anything out of the account.
Right. So if you know, if somebody lies, they do it for money or attention or negotiation or bargaining with. I mean, none of this stuff matters to me anymore. I am retired on disability, in fact, atrocious disability, but I and one could say that I wrote everything I wrote on Quora and Medium for attention, right? Only I don't check it all the time. I go weeks, months without checking it. Then I write for a month a lot on that, but recently I've been working on my novel characters and outlines and stuff. So I haven't been, so it's not really attention. I think that certainly if you're going to develop yourself into a fiction writer, I think that you would be more apt to try things out, right? Because one of the keys in writing fiction is that it has to make sense, right? Because if it doesn't make sense, then you can't translate through writing. Right, the other person's going to put the book down because it doesn't make sense, right? So, Frank's story doesn't make sense. There's a disconnect between what he expressed and what I experienced. And, I even played it back that someone was playing a prank on me. Like, I actually thought somebody was playing a prank on me, right?
Mm-hmm. It's a reasonable thing to think, yeah.
But over that month or so after he left, I worked with those same nurses. I brought them other patients. And he really freaked people out. I mean, he freaked I'd say 5 or 6 people were truly freaked out by that. And if Frank had been like an intelligent stockbroker or an office CEO or something like that, or a lawyer or a doctor, right? People could have said that was a brilliant mind, being associative, maybe caught a glimpse of everything. Frank was my understanding was he was a hick farmer that was semi-retired from nowhere, Ohio. He was flown in he was driven, I think, to Adena and then flown in and then literally through our ER to our OR. Because people were like, well, he probably worked as an electrician in the, and I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think so. I imagine Frank would figure out whether something had power by going, I'll tell you in a second. And I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever seen a patient more happy to be alive. He really freaked people out about how alive he was, because he was dead when he got to Ohio State. And just shockingly alive, days later. It's one of those things where, you kind of get the whole gamut in healthcare, right? But you don't really see that a lot, right? They come in so bad and they pop out, so good. And, but no, he freaked out nurses, because I remember them talking for weeks saying that was the darndest thing, and that could you have an out-of-body experience? Is that possible? And, I said, I kept telling him I didn't know what his anesthetic level was when he came into the OR. I have no idea. And somebody, like an older anesthesiologist, said, well, they flipped the lights upside down when they put the caps on, right? He probably just didn't have his eyes taped. He probably looked right at him. And for him, done, story over, right? And when I wrote that story, I can tell you, I don't think that actually happened. I think he, with his experience in thousands of ORs, placed that experience on top of Frank's story, because then it made sense to his brain. But when I really think about it, I was like, no, because the lights were over there, because we were doing CPR as we moved him over. So they were over there, not over here. And so, I mean, I do remember things like that. And it just, as far as I'm concerned, there's no way this guy didn't read the serial number staring at him up there. How that happened is,
so do you think
it's a leap.
So do you think there is some kind of what we'd call paranormal aspect to it, as far as our current understanding of how consciousness should work under anesthetic and during, was it cardiac arrest?
Yeah. So he came in after cardiac arrest, and he came in with very, very minimal heart function, and he required compressions to maintain a blood pressure. So, my understanding of consciousness shouldn't have been possible in him, but once we had him on the operating table, and once I had much better control of the drugs going into his system, and we could directly massage the heart because we cracked the chest. We actually had really good blood pressure on him. So he clearly was perfusing everything. He was just cold. And so it is quite possible he was conscious during that time, paralyzed and conscious. But his consciousness clearly wasn't in his body from his description. And his description is that he was up there a long time, like lots of parts of the surgery.
Did he talk about perceptions that he saw while he was out of his body during periods where he would have been unconscious? Like if he was saying he heard you talking about something, and that while you were saying that he shouldn't have been conscious.
So he asked some questions that were really weird. The nurse, she told me that when he woke up, he said, "What does going on pump mean? What does coming off pump mean?" He goes, because they just kept saying they wanted to come off pump again. And he goes, I don't understand why. That was like his first thing that he talked about. And then she, of course, was like, okay, he's got some recall. And then they said, well, that's normal during cardiac surgery. Sometimes when there's fluid change, blah, blah, blah. They gave him all that stuff. And he's like, no, he goes, I was staring down at all of you talking. That's like how the whole thing started. And then when people didn't believe him, he goes, I was up there forever. He goes, I could tell you the serial numbers on the top of the stupid lights. And then he read them off, and that's when everyone was like, got weirded out. That first time. And then that next morning, I was weirded out. And of course, everybody works on different days and different shifts and stuff. So it took that period of time, and he was out of the ICU. But really, the conversations I had with nurses over that 3 weeks, that was weird. Because they were just like, that was a big recall. And, they even talked like, how do we talk to patients about that? How do we, how do we deal with that with nurses? I remember them talking about, should we have a protocol for recall? Like, they were truly weirded out. Like, they wanted somebody to go, okay, if this happens again, you do A, B, C, D, So if I'm lying, then it was a shared delusion.
Mm. I don't believe for a second that you're lying. I don't think anybody. Any sane person would.
My wife has heard me free. She heard it because we were dating at the time, we were married at the time, and she was. I think the second child was here, but it was an infant. And in the wee hours of the night, when the baby would get up at night, I would even question her, saying, has anything like that ever happened to you in the OR? And she'd be like, well, yeah, I've had a case of recall, but nobody was reading the serial lights off. And she's like, it's okay. She's like, it's not like you were the only one they talked to, but I can remember I was freaked out that for a period of time. One of the things I think that made me less freaked out was that I got onto the committee that then investigated the entire operating room's incidents. So then for me, it became very mechanical, right? I could take my emotional veneer got thrown away, and I just needed to do this for my department. So that was one of the things that I think helped me deal with it personally. Because it is disturbing to think about. You're anesthetizing these people and you believe you have total control, and they're floating around the room looking at you. That's just not a good feeling.
See, for me, that would really raise kind of interest in me, because if we're given this anaesthetic that we know that with 99.9% certainty they're not going to recall or whatever, and yet they're recall in such a way that is completely unnatural to their brain state and how they should perceive a recall. Like, it's
right
saying,
now,
if he was
to tell you the truth, though, Frank did not receive a lot of anesthetic. Frank was dead. I did not have to anesthetize him. So, other than paralyzing him, and other than occasionally running some gas to get the right vasodilation and contraction that I needed in the arteries, I don't remember. I don't think I gave him anything. I didn't give him any of the Versed. I didn't give him any of the high dose narcotics. Nothing, because I had him on medications. I basically had him on adrenaline and other medications dripping in second by second to stabilize his heart function and keep his blood pressure. Other than paralyzing him, I didn't do much. And I can even remember saying, if I'm going to get a case of recall, it's going to be this guy.
Yeah.
I think I actually said that to the surgeon.
So the best and only real explanation I could think of then is that he was aware, but only aware enough to be able to take in the serial number of the light when it was flipped upside down. And he could see that number, but maybe not consciously, so that his brain then had to fill in the gaps that he was floating above it. But I don't see that would be very specific.
He then listening to our entire conversation could have put together, he was in an operating room, could have put together the entire, he could have imagined it himself.
Sure.
Like
but
I
why
said,
it would be from a position above? It would be because that's not a natural position. I don't know why your brain would fill in from a position that's unnatural to you.
Yeah, and it was. It was very weird the way he described it. Just that. I was floating, but I couldn't fall. I believe he said I couldn't fall. Like I should fall, but I couldn't fall. And we're like, okay. And he remembers he knew our conversations. Like, it was really weird. Like he knew that I just wanted to give him a shot to get him to the ICU where his family could say goodbye. Like he knew that I had gone over that with the surgeon several times because the surgeon was like, this guy's not going to come off pump. His heart's dead.
And so during that time when you were talking to the surgeon about that, was he in a position where he shouldn't have been conscious whatsoever? Or was he in a state where there could have been? No. No, I was still supporting his blood pressure, and we had a mechanical pump running his blood in his body. So theoretically it was possible he was conscious, but he shouldn't have been. He absolutely shouldn't have been. So, I believe that Frank's experience is clearly part recall, but the specificity of his recall and the position he explained is unlike any case I've ever had. If you want to know what I think happened was, and if you want the simplest explanation, is he died. He didn't want to leave. We kept working on the body till the heart, because the heart's a big dumb organ. If you can give it oxygen and sugar, it'll beat, right? And then over the next 24 hours, 36 hours after getting it started and everything, he put himself back together. That's how I remember it now. It doesn't seem odd to me anymore, So do you think you could consider that maybe evidence more of that it was all in his mind, all in his brain, or do you think that there could have been some sort of paranormal separation of the consciousness from the body? What do you think is more likely from your experience?
From the way I was freaked out, I can tell you that I believe this was a paranormal experience. I have done everything I can to rationalize that it was not. I have believed what other people have told me. I've believed what my brother has told me. But yet, my mind goes back and says that's not actually what happened. And when I actually think about what happened, I am up against feeling freaked out by the experience.
And as a
so
trained...
that's what makes it paranoid. Right. That's what makes it paranormal for me, is that it freaked me out.
Yeah, and your thoughts, as I say, as a trained anesthesiologist who's dealt his whole life with objectivity, you'd have thought that anything that could have been explained naturally, you would have been in on straight away.
Straight away. No, it's more than that. I wanted it to be those things, and I just know that it wasn't. I've been in that OR with my wife, explaining what happened, showing her where the lights are and why this and that, and and she's like, I don't know, babe. It's really, at the end of the day, she's like, I wasn't here,
So I think when Chris says what what do you say about people who say you're lying? I think what that entails as well is that a lot of people, especially in these sort of fields of out-of-body experience, near-death experience, terminal lucidity, they all say it's only an anecdote, it's worthless in terms of evidential value.
It's a story. I wish that would have happened today, because today Frank would be on social media talking about it, and then all these people wouldn't go through my recollection of it and my understanding and re-understanding it in order to move on with my career as an anesthesiologist. You know, they would get it from Frank, right? And you know, the other thing that would happen today is we'd have massive electronic records, and we'd be able to go right back and we'd be able to do a lot of stuff that we couldn't do previously. And it's a shame, because it was a little bit of a freak out point in my career, right? But you know, I went on and I did the next case, and I did the next case, and I did the next case, and it was, you know, after a while, I was like, gosh, that was a pretty big case of recall, and that's what it was chalked up to. I think I wrote the story as part of my own emotional processing, because I've written quite a few things on Quora as part of that. But again, you're getting the objective scientist explaining the story, because I want the reader to see and feel what I did and hear what I did. So I try to write in that very, very realistic tone, you know. And I don't know if you've read some of the other stuff I've written that's popular on there, but when I do it really well, I'm in that tone of realism. And so, you know, I guess if the whole thing made sense, I would say it's fiction, you know, but it doesn't make sense. So, which is really weird, because like, it doesn't make sense. So clearly you're lying, right? I mean, have you read the comment threads?
Not specifically on yours, but I've read enough online comments to know exactly what it would be like.
I don't know how defensive I got with people. I don't know that I did. I honestly don't remember. But you know, it's hard to write something from your own conception, and then you put it out there and people are like, well, that's not what happened. And you're like, okay, well, that's what I remember. You know, and I certainly have worked with, doctors on both plaintiffs and defense work on legal teams. And so I'm very aware of reconstructive memory, like how you can lie even to yourself. But then the question, you know, at least in plaintiffs and defense work, there's always a reason they're lying to themselves, right? They're either trying to protect themselves or to move a blame somewhere else. But in this instance, there is no gain in Frank's story being complete fabrication.
No, and as you said, you wanted to be able to explain it. So if your brain was trying to kind of false sense you into this memory, it would be putting parts together that fit your understanding. But as you still can't explain it, you'd have thought that maybe is not an issue.
No, I don't think it's an issue. I mean, I literally, it's one of those things like, let's say you saw a UFO one night, like really saw it, like pulled the car over, there it is in the sky.
Big disc lights
clearly
everywhere.
Not a man-made craft, right? And then it just whips off and takes off. You were so shocked you didn't pull your phone out.
Mm. Now what?
You go to talk to people, right? Well, you're lying. You're lying. And you're like, no, I was standing right there. Right there. Right? And then what would happen to that story over time? Well, was it a helicopter? Was it that? I mean, people are going to start adding to whatever you think it was. But I'll tell you, the other thing I remember is people didn't want to talk about it. That was the other thing. That there was even me, I didn't want to talk about it at the time because I was anesthesiologist, OSU job. Don't talk about this shit, you know? So it was, there was nothing comfortable about the experience overall. I wrote it from a point of view of being very safe after my career is done. And it was what it was, Could it have been as simple as Frank seeing him? Maybe. I don't think so. It was, and here's the thing, the serial numbers on the lights was one thing, but that was not what freaked people out. What freaked people out was the memory of our conversations that he had. And I mean, they were freakishly accurate, like there was a recorder going on. I mean, he didn't like his surgeon. He didn't like his surgeon because his surgeon kept wanting to stop the operation because it was futile.
It must have been nice for him. Yeah. And
I told him, look, at least let me show off my skills and get the porterhouse steak to the ICU. Because we can at least do that. The family was on its way up from Southern Ohio. I mean, I was like, let's not let him die in the OR when we could just get him back to the unit. But, those were, privileged conversations between two professionals trying to make the best decision of what they're doing, and yet our patients listening to the whole thing. I even thought that one of the nurses had talked to him from the OR. Like, I actually thought one of the nurses had gone and talked to him, because we did not fight about it, but I would say that we had a professional disagreement about how far to take his care. And I was very young in my career, and the guy was probably he's probably 2/3 of the way through his career. He'd done it, seen it. This guy wasn't going to make it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it was, but yeah, it was, that was the moment. The conversation memory was, which I can explain. The anesthetic was off. He clearly had consciousness, so he remembers the auditory, but that's not how he describes it. He describes it from above, that the surgeon, and he said the surgeon had a spider on his head. It wasn't a spider, it was a pair of loops. I don't know if you know what that looks like, but the big loop thing with so it's like, it looks like, so do you know what a construction hat looks like if the construction hat wasn't on it? You know that frame that sits on your head? So that sits there, and then there's wires that come off it to a big light in the front.
Right, okay.
And then he has two huge spectacles that move out like that. But he described it as a huge spider on his head. And the spider kept looking at me when I would talk. I mean, there was little shit like that you were like, you got to stop. That's not real. That can't be real. Right?
That can't be real. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was little stuff like that. It was freakish about the way he described it.
As we say, if he was just hearing the conversation, his recall would be, I was lying on the table, unable to move. I could see the serial number above me, and I could hear what you were saying. It wouldn't be, logically, you wouldn't jump to, I was up here, I could see the spider on the guy's head, and I was looking at the serial number from above.
I can remember, it's funny because I'm talking to you, like I can remember little things like, it's the darndest thing when you're looking at your own beating heart. I'm like, no normal situation covers that, but if you're above and the spread, you're looking at your own beating heart. It's exactly what it looks like from above. And then I had another colleague, because I was working massive hours during this time, right? And, this was months later, and I was telling him about it. He's like, oh, yeah. He goes, I heard about the recall and the cardiac case and everything. He says, but, he says, the things you remember when you work like us, they get all blended together. The cases run together. You don't know whether you're dreaming or awake or whether the case happened or whatever. And, it was weird because even a year later, like there was another ICU case. It was a trauma, not a heart case, where they had recall. And I was in there, not on that trauma case. I was taking the case like a couple rooms over back to the OR. And they were freaking out about this recall, and they were talking about Frank's case as I was moving this out. So it wasn't simply me that he freaked out. He
Yeah.
freaked out a whole bunch of nurses.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
So there's definitely an impact there. So something is certainly very.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, my practice changed. I made sure people were asleep after that. Like, even if it meant they took 20 or 30 extra minutes in recovery, I was okay with that. You know, I'd rather you not remember anything than go home early. So that's what I remember about that time was, and it's really funny because I'm actually having an uncomfortableness the closer I get to some of those memories. Like I heard him talk about looking at his own beating heart in my head, and it's uncomfortable. It's physically uncomfortable right now, even though it happened more than 15 years ago.
It's
only because I've been sitting here talking and thinking about it, right? So, you know, if I made it up or I'm lying, well, great. Then I'm spooking myself out with a great story too. You know, I should be Stephen King, right?
Yeah, yeah.